Welcome, everybody. My name is Andrés Páez. I was asked by the organizers to organize this panel on cognitive bias and judicial reasoning, or evidential reasoning, and I'm very grateful to them for this opportunity. We have 5 speakers, including myself. So we're going to do 3 speakers before the coffee break and then 2 speakers afterwards. And then at the end we will have some time for discussion, general discussion, to use the time for whatever comes up. So without further ado, our first speaker is Federico from Argentina. Federico is a researcher at CONICET, which is this wonderful Argentinian institution which just lets people do research. And he also teaches at the National University in Córdoba and at the Universidad Blas, Pascal. So the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes, and I'll tell you when we have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Well, hi everyone. Thanks, Andrés, for inviting me. I am like a gate pressure. It's just last minute entrance, so thank you very much. And also to all the people from the University of Girona. I would like to sorry, because F5, no?
F5.
Okay. Okay. Well, my talk is about implicit bias mostly, so I will try to justify why I'm in a workshop about cognitive bias. And what I will try to do is just to explore some conceptual and normative connections between bias and other discussions in the field. So I would like my talk to be precisely perceived just like that, just like an exploration, a proposal to think about some issues. It will be divided in 2 main sections. The first one, a concept exploration, and the second one about some normative claims. In the first part, I will just to point out some overlapping between cognitive bias and implicit bias. Then I will propose a distinction between bias as a cause and bias as a result. And then I will, on that basis, introduce 2 different approaches against bias, that is perfectionism and consequentialism. And with having said that, I will use, I hope, the larger part of my talk about some normative claims regarding how to avoid the effects of bias on legal reasoning and evidential reasoning. One of those remedies is the use of generalizations, grounded generalizations. We should use grounded generalizations to avoid the incident of implicit bias in our reasoning. I will try to show that that remedy is at odds with the requirement of treating others as individuals. And then the last part, I will try to offer some solutions to that apparent incompatibility between the two things. Here. So the variety of bias, I will not spend too much time on this because I think it's very well known. You know, it is usual to distinguish between cognitive bias. They are just heuristic ways of reasoning that violate some logical rules or some probabilities theories, and they are mostly associated with some structural traits or characteristic of our brains. It's just something that inevitably our brain does. Instead, social or implicit bias is sometimes considered as just about social categories. It's something that we learn because we are part of some culture, and what usually characterize implicit or social bias is that they are there is a disagreement between our explicit attitudes and the attitudes that we call implicit bias. So even if I may claim that I am not a racist, or I am sincerely claim that, I may sometimes do things that implicitly are caused by this racist bias that I may have learned because I am part of a racist culture. And so there is a disagreement between self-report and what I actually do because of the implicit bias. There are different conceptual proposals regarding implicit or social bias. One of that is to distinguish between an implicit attitude and an implicit belief, more or less, a cognitive state. When the implicit bias is an attitude, it is called an implicit prejudice, and when it is a belief or a cognitive state, it's called an implicit stereotype. So what I'm interested here is just to point out that even if we can distinguish between cognitive bias and implicit or social bias, there are certain points of overlapping, because, for example, take, for example, confirmation bias. If I am a teacher, I explicitly say that I am not going to discriminate between my students. I will try to interact with them equally. If I have a disabled student, nevertheless, I may treat him or her with some condescendency because I think that he cannot learn as well as the other students implicitly, even if I sincerely say that I will not treat him differently. So that's an implicit or social bias, and it will make me so I will have the tendency to look for evidence that he is not so good at some exams, and I will try to disregard evidence that will show me that he is actually a good student, and that's a confirmation bias. Okay, so, and there are other examples also with representativeness bias or availability bias. There are ways in which implicit bias may affect my reasoning. So I think that there is an overlapping between the two of them. And there is cognitive bias called in-group bias. There is it's sometimes described in different ways, but we can conceive of the in-group bias as the bias according to which we have the tendency to treat people of a certain group as homogeneous. That's when I have an in-group bias, I will not distinguish people that belong to the same group. I will not be able to see the differences between people that I include in one group. And that's mostly an implicit or social bias also. So, but the distinction that I would like to propose that I think applies to some cognitive bias and to some implicit bias is the distinction between bias as a cause and bias as a result. What I mean by this is I think we should distinguish between the fact that our reasoning is caused by a heuristic way of reasoning that violates some logical or probabilistic rules, and the fact that the result of that reasoning may be wrong or not. So, for example, confirmation bias, I may, as a teacher, have that bias regarding that disabled student, but nevertheless, it can be the case that actually he's not as good as the others. So, for example, there is an example used by Andrés in one of his papers about the taxi drivers and elementary school teachers in Colombia. He says, well, if you ask someone if a man who is patient and you have seen that he's good with children is a taxi driver or an elementary school teacher, most people will say, well, he's an elementary school teacher, disregarding the base rate that taxi drivers are much more than elementary teacher in Colombia. Men who are elementary teachers are just a few, instead taxi drivers that are men are a larger number. So that's true, that's an error regarding probabilities, but we could still ask, but this man is a taxi driver or elementary school teacher. If I treat someone who has that characteristic as an elementary school teacher, and he is nevertheless the probabilistic on one side, an elementary school teacher, the result of that bias reasoning will be correct. So, and I think this distinction is important because we can have two different approaches regarding bias. A perfectionist approach, that is, we will try to make people learn to reason correctly. That's an educational project. And I think that so far, at least in the literature that I know, the most preferred approach has been this one regarding judges. We have to make some programs in order for judges to learn how to reason correctly, to learn logic, to learn probability. They need to improve their minds. And instead, the consequentialist approach will be interested just in the result. I am not interested to improve judges' mind. I just want them to take the correct decisions. So I will be interested just in the evaluation of the result of the reasoning. Whether the Colombian is a taxi driver or an elementary school teacher, that's what I am interested in. And it is precisely regarding this difference between two kinds of approach that I think we can identify in the literature one proposed remedy against the incidence of bias in evidential reasoning, that is the use of generalizations. I think that this is the second section of the presentation, what I would call a plea for generalization. So, for example, a field where bias is usually at work in evidential reasoning is regarding the assessment of the credibility or fiability of the witness, of a witness testimony, paradigmatic of the testimony of a victim of sexual violence. So there is an example in Argentina, but we can, I'm sure we can find in other legal systems too, of victim in an exchange with the supposed, with the defendant, and the victim of sexual violence, when the defendant said that the victim has given him the preservative. I don't remember the word in English. Is the assumption? No, el preservativo. The condom. Thank you. The victim has given him the condom. Sorry, I was. She didn't react. So she said nothing. So the judges, on that basis, conclude that she was lying about the consensual nature of the intercourse because she didn't react. And that is the result of implicit bias regarding how victims of sexual violence should act. So they put the woman in a category, and on that basis assume that she should behave in a certain way if she would have been saying the truth. So what the defender of generalization said is, well, the judge, instead of use that or let that implicit bias affect his reasoning, should have used a grounded generalization, a grounding psychological generalization about how actual victims of sexual violence behave. So if you look at psychology books, you will find that victims of sexual violence behave differently as the judges assume. In most cases, victims tend to avoid the attackant, try to spend the less amount of time with him in the same room, so probably the fact that she didn't react was provoked by that. She will expect for the interaction with her applicant and the sooner as possible. So, and that is a grounded generalization because it is based on empirical data. So instead of letting his implicit bias affect the result, if he will use a grounded generalization, his reasoning will be correct. So, and that's, for example, what Ornstein said in one of her papers, that abused women exhibit many of the characteristics associated with liars. They hesitate, change their story, procrastinate, reporting the incident, and so on. That's a grounded psychological generalization. Obviously, we are talking about what has been called non-spurious generalization. It is maybe not so exact wording, because non-spurious are generalizations that instantiate causal relations, and here non-spurious, for the people that advance a plea for generalization, means just with statistical support, that this generalization supported by data. I think that one advocate of this generalization is Fred Schauer, and I think at this point I've been hearing about generalization and a plea for generalization all over our evidence week. Obviously, the fact that generalizations are advanced as a remedy for implicit bias is due to the central role that generalizations play in evidential reasoning. That's something that Michele Tarufo has insisted upon, and it is also in the analysis of evidence book by Twinin and his colleague. And generalizations are the link between the element of proof and fact statements. So I think that it is clear how generalization, we can come back to this in the discussion, but it is clear that generalizations play a central role in evidential reasoning, so they can avoid the effects of implicit bias if we draw upon them and they are grounded generalization. So there are some problems regarding this proposal. How to gather, this is common discussion, how to gather the empirical data, the statistical ambushes, and the Trojan in the stock of knowledge. No? Because how to gather the empirical data, there are some bias that can be replaced by certain generalization, but it's not always clear that we can obtain the data that will prove those generalizations grounded. It is not a statistic about a certain kind of person and not easily to construe. It is not always easy to gather the empirical data, maybe because it is difficult to make some interviews, or because we don't actually have at the moment of the trial that information. So it is not always easy to establish whether a particular generalization is grounded or not. Statistical ambushes is another criticism against those who advance the plea for generalizations, and that is the argument according to which even if sometimes we can gather the data, we are not always sure that the data are not themselves biased, no? Because sometimes we use generalization based on police statistics, and sometimes they are just construed on the basis of what they do, and what they do sometimes, if not very frequently, is already biased. No, the Lombroso problem, he has very precise statistics regarding people who commit crimes, but he was just looking at people already close in prison. So that's what I would call statistical statistical ambushes. And another problem is similar or linked to the second one, that's the Trojan in the stock of knowledge. One thing that both Tarufo and Anderson Schumann twinning claim is that we can ground some generalizations on our stock of knowledge. That is, if a generalization belongs to our stock of knowledge, that is what we as a community know, we can use that generalization. We can conceive of that generalization as grounded, because that allows us to solve the problem of the gathering of statistical data. There are generalizations that it's very difficult to ground in statistical data, but if they belong to our stock of knowledge, we can nevertheless consider them grounded. Well, the problem is that the stock of knowledge is not explicit and ordered set of statements or generalizations. It's something that is socially construed, so we have to transform that in statements, and also in that in the culture that we are talking about may be already bias inside that stock of knowledge, and they clearly recognize that, and they say it is true that we cannot talk about a cognitive agreement, because sometimes the generalizations are based on some conception on what it is good or bad, and about that there is a great deal of disagreement in a society. So there are other problems regarding this remedy that consists of using generalizations. I think that these three first problems may be at a certain point overcome. That is, we can at least there will be some generalizations that are grounded, so there will be at least some cases in which this strategy will function. We can use that strategy to avoid the incidence of implicit bias. Not all generalizations can be grounded, but I am sure that some of them, at least some of them, can be grounded, and in those cases they may be used to avoid the incidence of bias in our reasoning. But well, that's the generalization that I think it is grounding and could be used. That's the same one that was below. But I think that one problem about the use of generalizations in order to avoid the incidence of implicit bias in our reasoning is the requirement of treating people as individuals, treating others as individuals. And I think it is important because in some discussion, the problem with implicit bias is precisely that sometimes when we act on the basis of bias or of a social bias, we do not treat people as individuals. So if our remedy provokes the same discriminatory effect, it will not be actually a real remedy. At least that's what I'm trying to argue. As I said at the beginning, this is exploratory. I am proposing arguments. I will be very happy to hear what you think about them. So, for example, there are here statements by two scholars claiming that when we stereotype, and as I said at the beginning, an implicit bias may be an implicit stereotype, we do not treat people as individuals. No? So, stereotyping involves seeing individuals member through a narrow and rigid lens of group-based image, rather than being alive to the range of characteristics constituting each member as a distinct individual. All stereotyping involves this masking of individuality. And something similar says Alexander Timmer. The first one was by Bloom in an article from 2004, and something similar says Alexander Timmer in an article of 2011. So the problem with this kind of reasoning is that we don't treat people as individuals. Even if it is a very common claim, it is not always clear what they mean by this requirement of treating others as individuals. One way of framing this requirement is that we should treat people on the basis of information that we can gather by direct perception of the individual traits of the particular person. So what we should do instead of base our interaction with other people on stereotypes is to look for information that people can offer to me in that particular interaction. So the judge, in the case that I mentioned at the beginning, instead of basing the reasoning regarding the victim on their implicit stereotypes, should try to interact with the victim to look for information, individual information about that woman, to try to understand, to know if she is lying or not. That we should interact more with each other in order to avoid the effect of bias or stereotypes. So one important question regarding this requirement is, can we it is possible to satisfy the requirement. That's well, is it possible to treat others as an individual when we understand that in this sense? Well, what I will call the flooding effect is the claim of some scholar according to which it is not possible to treat others as individuals if this is understood as treating others without using generalizations. And that's a claim made by Fred Schauer. We discussed that claim yesterday. And also by another scholar, Lippert Rasmussen. Yes? Just 5 minutes? Oh, okay. I thought I had more time. So what they said is mostly, well, it is not possible to treat others as individuals, if that means treating others without using generalization, because generalization, to say it briefly, are all over our perceptual or all over our reasoning about how we approach facts. And for example, Schauer says, if I observe a brown cow and I identify it as such, that identification is actually based on the fact that visual perception like that in the past has been correlated with the existence of a cow, and that's why I can say that now that I have the same perceptual experience, I am in front of a cow again. And Rasmussen said all individual perceptions are based on the wide shoulders of statistics. So even if you are looking at someone and trying to understand if she is a liar or not, all that you will receive through your senses from that person will have to pass through our previous generalization regarding that kind of sense impression. So it will be nevertheless based on generalizations. So Schauer has a more skeptical, draw a more skeptical conclusion from this, and he will just reject the requirement of treating people as individuals. Instead, Lippert Rasmussen proposed to a revisionist account of the requirement, that to treat others on the basis of all relevant information, on the basis of all relevant generalizations, that will be to him to treat someone as an individual. Well, I see that the order of the titles were not good, so I think that these claims produce what I call the flooding effect. That is, they try to introduce a good distinction between generalizations and individual information, but if we take that road just as long as they proposal, will end by claiming that there is no actual individual information. And that's what I call the flooding effect. There are just generalizations. What try to be a good distinction, and by eliminating one part of the distinction. That's something that happens in philosophy frequently. The flooding effect, introducing a distinction, ends up by just eliminating one of the elements of the distinction. And just in these minutes left, defense of the requirement. I think that it is just an egg-chicken problem, and when we find that kind of problem in philosophy, I think that that's a sign that it is not a very good question. And for example, And again, these are explorations of things that I'm trying to figure it out. For example, when Lippe Rasmussen said that causal perception is based on the wide shoulder of statistic, or Schauer said that when we perceive an individual, we use generalizations to connect those perceptions with what we saw before. I think that those generalizations and those statistical bases that they mention need individual perceptions for their construction. What is a generalization other than something that we infer from individual instances of certain cases? So I think it is true to perceive an individual, we base our perception on previous generalizations, but to construct those generalizations, we need to have perceived individual instances of what we are generalizing about. So I think that this shows that it's an egg-chicken problem, so I don't think that there will be a good answer to that problem. And maybe to give a better shape to the requirement and to the use of generalizations in our reasoning, we can distinguish between generalization as a support of factual statement and generalization as warrant of a factual statement. A generalization as support is a generalization that includes the information that we are trying to gather from our individual perceptions. And for example, a liar, a person that acts in some ways is a liar. That will be a support generalization in order to know if an individual person is a liar. But a warrant generalization are all those generalizations that define or that establish how causal perception works, how our body perceives certain facts, how in the past some impressions have caused certain kind of mental state, etc. So those are generalizations that do not include in their content the statement that we want to prove. So it is true that we need always to use generalization as warrant, but I will say what the requirement of treating others as individual is not to use in order to attribute a particular characteristic to a person, generalization as support. That would be my claim regarding how to understand the requirement. And well, I can stop there and
so we have time for a few questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so really enjoyed the talk. I think it's really interesting. And I guess my question is about real-world implementation of this. If someone buys into this notion of grounded generalizations, how do we actually make this work? And if you're thinking, well, we can have judicial training sessions, or maybe there could be a video prior to voir dire in the United States where all the jurors get to watch something about ground generalizations. To me, my worry is these things are so sticky, right? The stereotypes, the negative affect, that we need to intervene way earlier. But even there, I wonder if it's going to work. And a short story, I have a nephew, my daughter, playing together, 3 and 4 years old. I hear my nephew say, no, Mira, trains are for boys. So I go over and I explain the ground generalization. No, actually, toys are for everyone, and girls can love. And at the end, he listens. He's my nephew, and he picks up the train. He says, "Trains are for boys." And so I wonder if at age 4 we already have this stickiness, the exposure that there are boy clothes and girls clothes, and boy toys and girls, and that expands into what a boy is supposed to do in romantic situations. They get to college. Can we ever get the right generalizations that we want if they're being exposed in so many different ways at an early age?
Yes, I understand what you're pointing at. That's why I think even if it is not a sharp distinction, that we should distinguish between these two kinds of approaches, between what I will call a perfectionist one and a consequentialist one. Because in that case, for example, I will say, what are we interested in? In changing the mind of the boy or letting girls play with the train? So we can decide maybe it is important to do both things, but we maybe can start by letting the girl play with the train no matter what the boy thinks about that. So, and maybe that is going to change the boy's mind better than trying to address him directly. And there has been some studies, it is also exploratory studies, even if they draw conclusions more categorically, but I think that they are just exploratory, that show that to address someone directly regarding his or her bias is not a good strategy, because it usually provokes some reactions, like trains are for boys, no? They reaffirm their position, they feel attacked. So, and maybe we should try the other approach. It is not easy to figure it out how it will work in every case, but I think that that's a better strategy. So, not so much interested in changing the judge's mind, and maybe he can be a bigot outside the court, but what I will try is, what I'm interested in is that what he writes in his or her decisions is something that agree with facts as how they were. I know that's what I think. Yes.
So just to clarify that last point, you're saying what you care more about is what he articulates as his reasons for something, as opposed to what he. So he could actually, in his heart of hearts, be saying, actually, I think this woman is faking, or she's whatever the thing is, but as long as he writes it in a way that does not perpetuate that negative stereotype, that's progress, or that's okay?
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
Yes. That's okay if it is actually the case that the woman is not a liar. No, that's what I am interested in. I think we should be interested in.
I mean, I guess just to follow, my worry is just that it's not enough. I mean, I just feel like judges, they will come to the training session, they will say, yes, I agree with you, and then in an actual case, if it's an acquaintance rape at a college campus, they're just going to go with the stereotypes. They're 70 years old, they know how men and women are, and they're going to go with whatever. And maybe they'll say, oh, and this was the exception to your general rule. I know this one is different than, I agree generally with what you're saying, but this is the exception.
Yes, maybe it should be a combination of both, but I guess that so far we have been mostly interested in changing judges' mind, and I think that maybe at least, if not just, at least introduce this other concern about the results. I think that's the important thing. If judges are not, are not sexist, but they still identify facts wrongly, that's what I will be concerned about.
Hi there, very interesting. So my question to you, I think I have two questions, is the basis of sort of this idea of grounded generalization that it's a concession to fact, or is it something that we sometimes aspire to? So do we sometimes want to have this grounded generalization and not try and treat everyone as individuals? And just to give you the backdrop to, so I'm from South Africa, we have something called Ubuntu, and it's basically a direct contestation that we want individualism. So it's the idea that sometimes individual rights cannot be as important as communal perceptions of rights, and the idea that some biases, even if it's untrue for an individual, is held as good, and that we should base our legal system on that.
Well, I will say maybe two things. The first one is a clarification that your question allows me to introduce. That is, I am not claiming that, or even in this literature, they are not claiming that the requirement to treat all as individual is a global requirement in every case. There are some cases in which it is a requirement, and maybe there are other things in which there is the opposite requirement of treating someone as a member of a group. And there is very important, for example, in South America, regarding indigenous people, that they claim that they should be treated as members of that group and not as an individual. But I think that we are talking about some issues regarding disadvantaged groups or groups that had suffered from discrimination in the past. That those are the central cases where the requirement arises. So that's one clarification. And the other one is that what people that make the advocates generalizations are claiming is that they are a tool just for the foundation of our beliefs. That it's a matter of facts or knowledge, and that is, if we have a grounded generalization, we can found our fact statement on them, but it still doesn't say anything about what we should do in those cases. So, because maybe a generalization is grounded because people in the past has suffered some kind of discrimination. So maybe in Argentina it is true that most women that are mothers are housewives, and we shouldn't maybe issue a law that gives only women the right of certain, I don't know, regarding, in order to allow them to carry on their care duties, because the fact that they are do that is an effect of past discrimination. But it is true that most women in Argentina are housewives. That's what people who advocate for generalization, for the use of generalization, are just saying. They are not advancing also a more robust normative claim regarding what we should do. I don't know if that answer was clear, but that's more or less the direction of an answer at least.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Let's
Hi everyone, my name is Mauricio. I will be part of this panel, but Andrés asked me to do as the moderator of his presentation to avoid bias in his self-control. So I give you Andrés Páez, a graduate scholar from University of Los Andes, Colombia, and his presentation will be on the epistemic risk of cognitive bias in evidential reasoning. Andrés, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I should start by saying that this is work in progress, so please be gentle. And I should also say that I'm a philosopher of science, I'm not a lawyer, so this will be an approach to the problem of cognitive bias in legal systems from the point of view of the philosophy of science. The topic is the epistemic risk of cognitive bias, so I should start by explaining what epistemic risk is. Oh, the font is all screwed up. Sorry about that. I don't know why that happened. Anyways, so when people talk about epistemic risk in philosophy of science, they usually refer to something called inductive risk. And inductive risk is just the distribution of false positives and false negatives when you use any type of statistical method. So depending on what kind of values you have, what kind of interest you have, the distribution will provide more false positives or more false negatives. For example, if you're doing medical testing, you might allow more false positives than if you're doing physics. If you want to discover a particle, then you want the probability of a false positive to be very, very, very small. So it's basically a pragmatic question. How you want to distribute false positives and false negatives. So in the case of law, the idea of epistemic risk understood as inductive risk is very well known because of the work of Larry Loudon, who has insisted a lot on this idea that the standard of proof is basically what distributes errors in judicial decisions. And the idea is that depending on where you set the standard of proof, you will have one distribution or another. So these are just numbers taken from his book, his most important book. So it depends on how you understand the social contract, how you understand people's rights, and all sorts of different pragmatic dimensions. You will have the idea that you will have 2 false acquittals for every false conviction, or you can have the Blackstone standard, which is 10-1, or Benjamin Franklin thought was 100-1, or Maimonides thought it was 1,000-1. Depends on how you move the line. You'll have more false convictions or less false convictions. But many people have argued that that's obviously not enough. Actually, on Monday and Tuesday, some of the speakers argued against the idea that just the standard of proof is not sufficient to understand the epistemic risk involved in judicial reasoning. So the idea is that we also have to take into account the robustness of the evidence and especially the validity of the inferences that we draw from the evidence. And of course, the real distribution of innocent and guilty defendants is also going to affect the distribution of errors within the judicial system. So if we think about the place for cognitive bias within this picture, I think the obvious place is to think that it is somewhere in the inferences we draw from the evidence towards the hypothesis. So this is the simplified version of the problem. But I want to approach this same problem from the point of view of the philosophy of science, because I think it brings some interesting elements that are not included in this very basic and bare bones picture. So I'm going to refer to something I call the extended view of epistemic risk. And this is mostly due to the work of Heather Douglas. It's a paper from 2000 called Inductive Risk and Values in Science. And there's a very nice summary of the problem in a more recent paper by Kupla and Bittel. So the idea is that the traditional view of inductive risk has focused on the transition from the evidence to a hypothesis. How you define, how you make that transition from the evidence to a hypothesis. But there are other moments when you're doing research when there's also a pragmatic dimension involved. In other words, you also have to use values and you also have to make decisions on what you want. And those involve the choice of methodology, how you gather and you characterize data, and also how you interpret and integrate that data as you go along. And these are all what we can call epistemic practices. These are ways of doing science that will establish one direction or another when you're doing research. So the idea is that just as there is a traditional view of epistemic risk and an extended view, there's also a traditional way of understanding the causes of epistemic harm and a more extended view of understanding what's going on. So for example, if you take just a traditional view, if given a set of values, if you set the standard of proof in the wrong place, then you will have the wrong distribution of false positives and false negatives. But there are other moments where you can also cause some harm in doing research. For example, you can just acquire mistaken beliefs because it's an inductive and an empirical enterprise. So of course there will be errors involved. You can make incorrect logical inferences as you go along, or you can, just because you're ignorant about some specific area that you're researching, you might end up doing more harm than good simply because of ignorance. But all of these errors, this kind of epistemic harm, they have two characteristics. First of all, they're value neutral. You're not making a decision, you're just making a mistake. And it's non-culpable ignorance. Just things that happen when you do research, errors that are made, and there's nothing really that you can blame somebody for any of those things. What I'm interested in is not that kind of epistemic harm, but rather the kind of epistemic harm that is introduced in research when you have a value-laden approach. In other words, when you're consciously making a decision to take one road and not another road. So the first way in which you can maybe harm people by introducing some kind of distinction is by the way you use concepts. For example, if you're doing research on depression, it makes a huge difference how you define depression. Because if you define depression too narrowly, maybe you will leave lots of people outside of your field of research, and they might be harmed by the way you define the concept. Also, you might decide to avoid certain types of evidence, to exclude it from your research, maybe because it's too expensive, maybe because you just you decide that it will be too time consuming, or for whatever reason. But you're also maybe harming your field of research in itself by excluding that evidence. And in many fields of science, you have to use models, and models are simplified pictures of reality. And when those models exclude certain variables, maybe the end result is also going to be harmful for your field of research, or harmful if it's applied research. It might be harmful to certain people. So what I want to explore here is this, that in law, especially in law, but also in other fields, there is also a decision to tolerate the excessive bias and excessive noise within the decision-making process. So of course, there's always going to be bias, there is always going to be noise, because we're human beings and cognitive bias cannot be entirely avoided. But my claim is that within the law, there is a tendency to allow too much bias. There's a tolerance towards excessive bias. And that's a decision. That's basically a decision which is value-laden. The judicial system is deciding to adopt certain rules of procedure which are allowing more bias than there should be. So the question is, why? Why is cognitive bias tolerated in law? So the way it is tolerated is through the use of some rules of procedure that are more likely to trigger biases. Rules of procedure that immediately trigger certain cognitive processes in judges, in juries, that we can avoid. That's the point. The point is that there are alternatives that can be used, and that the use of these specific procedural rules are ways of tolerating bias. So I think the answer to this question can be divided into two groups. There are some reasons which might be good reasons to tolerate bias. One reason could be the principle of immediacy. Maybe you don't want to sacrifice immediacy, and you have to find the right balance between immediacy and bias, and maybe there's no way of avoiding excessive bias because you want to respect that principle. Also, it might be that you want to preserve precedent or stare decisis, and that's too important within a certain legal system to give up, and within that traditional or that precedent, there might be ways of doing things which cannot be changed easily, and that might determine the ratio or the extent to which we have excessive bias. And also the protection of some of the legal rights of defendants. Many of those legal rights, of course, we don't want to give up. Sometimes there are certain rights which are just part of tradition. Maybe they can be examined, but that's why I call them arguably good reasons. But there are also very bad reasons for tolerating bias. So there are some arcane rules of evidence that are in the books, and people just don't bother to change them because that's how we have always done things, and nobody has questioned them. There's also pro-defendant bias, which is just the idea that once we have the standard of proof, maybe we want to help the defendant a little bit more with some extra help that we can provide through these rules of procedure. There's also the alleged incompetence of juries. Sometimes, especially in the American legal system, some evidence is not shown to the jury because supposedly it's going to affect them in negative ways, but maybe we're underestimating the capacity of juries. And this is very important. There's a huge resistance on the part of judges to lose some of the freedom they have to decide cases. So in Kahneman's most recent book on noise, there's an example of an act that was introduced in the US Congress to give some guidelines for sentencing, because sentencing was extremely noisy. In other words, judges can dictate sentence within a wide range of values from months to years, and with these guidelines, those things, the noise involved, the wide dispersion of sentencing decisions would be concentrated in a much wider, narrower range. But judges don't like to have their hands tied, so there's also lots of resistance. Now, maybe people haven't thought through why they kind of tolerate bias. So maybe there are some other reasons involved in this presence of bias in the system. For example, one could use what I call the ignorance excuse. The ignorance excuse would just be the idea that the harms that stem from cognitive bias are not widely known. Somebody could say, well, we just don't know this. We just don't know that cognitive bias can harm people. Therefore, that epistemic conditions to make us responsible for tolerating bias will not be fulfilled. But there are two dimensions to this idea. The first dimension is purely empirical. This is true that cognitive bias is not known widely in the legal system. And I think by now that excuse is kind of not very strong. If it's not, I think a question we should raise is whether there is an institutional duty to publicize the presence of cognitive bias. And if they are well known, then of course this is not an excuse at all. But there's also a normative dimension to this question. And the normative dimension is whether the members of the judiciary know about cognitive bias. Is there a professional duty to educate oneself? regarding these things? And is there an institutional duty to educate members of the judiciary about the presence of cognitive bias? And what I want to argue, in the rest of the paper, is that there is both an institutional and an individual duty to fight excessive bias, to stop tolerating excessive cognitive bias within the legal system. Now, there are other bad reasons why people might tolerate cognitive bias in law. And this is a quote from Fricker. She says, "The individual's power to ameliorate the situation is very limited. The kinds of procedural change we are imagining might help make amends and ensure it doesn't happen again are fundamentally institutional changes." And that's true. I mean, it's obvious that the institution has to change, not the individuals themselves. But this gives too much weight to the to the responsibility of an institution. I think that this gets individuals off the hook too easily. Another reason might be the bystander effect. So several people might observe an epistemic harm that ought to be prevented or mitigated, but fail to act because everyone assumes that the inaction of others reflects the group's conviction that no action is required. So nobody's doing anything about it. Maybe it's because nobody cares. So why should I do something about it? That might be, of course, it's a rationalization of why I'm not doing anything, but maybe some people will try to excuse their behavior, their individual behavior, using something like the bystander effect. There's also the blind spot effect. Members of the judiciary might think that, of course, we don't have cognitive bias in us because we're judges or professional deciders. So maybe they think that that affects other people, but not us. Or another element which is important here is that, as Posner says in some paper, courts are under no pressure to reform themselves. There's no revision of the quality of the decisions they make. I mean, judges make hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions per year, and it would be very difficult to control that. And there's no real pressure at all to change their ways. So of course, they just do what they have been doing all along. And the final excuse I want to present is what I call the helplessness excuse. And the idea is that if there's a problem that requires nothing short of a coordinated response, in other words, that people get together to help because an individual cannot do anything about it, then knowledge of a clear and definitive collective solution on the part of individuals is a prerequisite for epistemic responsibility. In other words, we need to know how we're going to address the problem. But somebody who could argue that nobody really knows how to solve the problem of cognitive bias in law, therefore, it's supposed to be a bit higher. Therefore, there is no obligation to respond to the problem because nobody knows how to solve it. It would be another way to try to get off the hook regarding the individual responsibility towards excessive cognitive bias. So I want to argue that there is a way to think that there is a collective epistemic obligation on the part of the judicial system, and there's also an individual responsibility that each of us have regarding the problem. And this is based on the work of Hendricks and Fleischer-Cecilia, a very recent work on collective responsibility, collective epistemic responsibility. And the idea is that a collective epistemic harm is a harm that can only be prevented I'm talking here about prevention, which is a point you were making, by a joint effort of several individual agents rather than by any single individual on their own. And what I want to claim is that the epistemic harm that caused by cognitive bias can be somehow prevented if we were able to at least detect those rules of procedure that are triggering cognitive bias, that are providing the excess cognitive bias within the system. So what is this all about? How much time do I have?
7.5.
Perfect. Okay, so there are two basic intuitions that I want to defend. The first idea is that the collective, in other words, the collective comprised by the members of the judiciary is responsible for not implementing ways of preventing cognitive bias. In other words, there's a collective responsibility for this excessive, or this tolerance for excessive cognitive bias. And also, the second intuition is that individual members also have individual responsibilities for tolerating excessive cognitive bias. Because they fail to contribute to that joint solution to the collective epistemic harm. So I'm going to explain these two intuitions that I want to defend. This is the part when it becomes really work in progress. So let's see how it goes. So the idea is that Fleischer and Cecilia are defending is that the way to think of a collective as being responsible for something is by thinking of the obligation as two independent duties. So the first duty to prevent a collective harm is that each individual has to be conscious that there is a harm being done. So it's an epistemic condition. It has to be fulfilled. And once you know that there's an epistemic harm being done, you have to raise awareness of the harm being done, and you have to mobilize other people to try to prevent it. In other words, you have to encourage other people to realize that there's a problem and that we should join forces to do something about the problem. So this provides individuals with a specific duty, and since every individual within the group has the same duty to raise consciousness and awareness and mobilize others, so individually within the group, most of us are going to be responsible for what's going on, for the epistemic harm being done. And once this group has, but most people in the group are aware of the epistemic harm. Okay, perfect. Then the group becomes a mobilized group. That's what they call it, a mobilized group. And when the group becomes mobilized, because most people are aware of the problem and most people know the harm being done, and they know that there is something they can do about it, then as a collective, they become responsible. But only after awareness has been raised within most of the individuals within the group. Now, to make this picture work, there are certain conditions that have to be fulfilled. And these are general conditions on epistemic responsibility in general. And I want to show, there are 4 conditions, and I want to show that they are fulfilled in this specific scenario, so that I can defend the idea that there is both an individual and a collective responsibility. The first is that there's an agency condition. In other words, the people who are responsible have to be able to understand and be receptive to epistemic reasons. Individuals, of course, can do that, but the legal institution, the judiciary branch, can be aware of those reasons as well. I mean, there are structures in place ways in which the judiciary can talk to the legislative branch and implement reform within the judicial system. Those are all reasons that can be argued for as a collective. So I think that the agency condition can be fulfilled both at the individual and the collective level. There's also a causal condition. So individuals have the ability to talk to other people and convince them that there is epistemic harm being done. And I think the judicial branch can also have that power to talk to Congress, for example, to try to implement change. So that is fulfilled as well. The epistemic condition, I think, is a little tricky in this case, because although I think there is growing consciousness about cognitive bias, not everyone is aware of how harmful it can be. So I think that it should be, I mean, part of my job here, I guess, is this workshop is to make sure that this condition is implemented, that most people become aware that there is an epistemic harm being done by cognitive bias. I think other speakers will talk about it, and that there are ways of preventing it. So that condition will be more fulfilled as we raise more consciousness. And finally, there is something called the no defeaters condition. In other words, the agent does not have any reason not to implement these changes. I think in the case of cognitive bias, there might be reasons. In other words, if you want to defend stare decisis, or if you want to defend the principle of immediacy, that's a defeating condition towards this idea that the branch is responsible, because there might be good arguments against changing. There might be good arguments against reform. But this allows defeaters to exist. But the idea is that if most members of the judiciary become convinced that those reasons are not strong enough, then the condition will be fulfilled. Okay. So, to conclude, I think those four conditions can be fulfilled in the case of responsibility for tolerating excessive cognitive bias, and therefore both individual members of the judiciary and the judicial system as a collective bear responsibility for any epistemic harm that stems from cognitive bias. Thank you.
Okay, Q&A.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the institutional excuse and why you're not, why you don't agree with Fricker, because I don't see much difference between Fricker's account and the idea of the collective epistemic harm. Actually, it looks to me that what the idea of the collective epistemic harm is doing is just qualifying Fricker's idea. So it's saying, yeah, the individual is kind of powerless unless we have joint effort. So, yeah.
Well, I guess the answer is that the individual is not powerless in the account that I have presented here, because the individuals have the power to convince others, and they have the power to raise awareness, and by creating a mobilized group, you have changed the nature of the institution itself. So this, I think this gets the individual off the hook too easily. It says individuals can't do anything, so we have to change. We have to wait for the institution itself to reform itself. But who's going to reform it? I mean, the idea here is that every individual bears responsibility for that reform by creating awareness and creating consciousness of the harms involved. That would be the difference. But of course, this points at the responsibility of the institution, of the legal institution itself. Yeah.
Laura? Daniela?
Thank you, Andrés, for the presentation. I would like you to maybe go a bit deeper on the idea that there are some rules of procedure that makes it easier that that social biases and cognitive biases work in law. What rules, or I don't know, what kind of institutional context you are thinking on? Because then you said that you linked it with immediacy. I don't know if it's immediacy in what you are thinking, or there's another institutional dimension of procedure that you link specifically with the cognitive biases.
Well, I think it depends on the legal system, of course, because every legal system has different rules. But I think that any rule that allows, for example, effects like the halo effect, when people present themselves as in a white coat or with a tie, or they look shabby or whatever, and that has an immediate effect on juries or on jurors or on the public. Those things are like the way the law has worked forever. I mean, and that's part of the principle of immediacy. But at the same time, there are ways of avoiding that by having written testimony in which things like there are certain elements that are known to immediately activate stereotypes can be avoided. If you have to go like rule by rule to know those things. This is where I take out my I'm not a lawyer card.
It's okay. It was
But that's the general idea. That's the general idea. I mean, you would have to revise the entire legal system to find those things. So I think
there's a good example you put, the pro-defendant rules, for instance. In my research, I have found out that judges are willing to allow any evidence from defendant because it's right of defense. So they admit whatever very unreliable, shitty evidence because it's from the defense. So
thank you.
My card of lawyer helping you.
I'll take it.
And on the side of this collective responsibility of the judiciary, what do you think about the response that consists in approving like protocols, no? To obtain a gendered perspective in judging, for example. Do you think this is useful, or?
Yeah, I think I like protocols. I think that protocols are great in diminishing the volume of noise within a system. That helps a lot. It's known to do that, for example, in the emergency room when people are brought in. If you follow a protocol, things are done more efficiently, and there is a more common response to those things. And there's a paper in Spanish where I advocate for protocols as well. So I think that those are great. The thing is that, as I said at some point, judges hate protocols because especially in the American legal system, judges are gods. So,
kings.
Kings. Oh God, yeah. God king. So, of course, you're going to find resistance to protocols, but I think that's one of the ways to go.
There's time for another short one.
In American system, we have the jury instructions, and the judges instruct the juries and address them the problem of implicit bias and ask them to stop and think if they are deciding by any prejudice or something. This kind of instructions may be effective.
I'm skeptical about that because just knowing about bias is not enough to get rid of it. Every single member of the police has been at this point somehow instructed about bias, prejudice, and it's completely ineffective. And I think that just knowing that biases exist within groups is also going to be ineffective to do anything. That's why I think that the way to go is to find better rules of procedure and not just try to change minds individually.
More?
Sure, there's time for it. Okay, so this, I guess, relates to what was said about individual and collective responsibility, as well as this question about instructions. Do you agree that that might be, I would be prepared to argue that that sort of conclusion you can actually base already on legal precedent in a way. I'm thinking about the European Court of Human Rights, for example. They made this distinction between subjective and objective impartiality. So the judge does not only have a responsibility to come across as impartial, for example, by not writing, stereotypical things in a verdict or something like that, but they also, in fact, have to be impartial. And I would be prepared to argue that that sort of places a responsibility when it comes to implicit bias too, both on the individual and the collective. And the question then, of course, as you have alluded to, is what can they do given that this is an implicit bias? And my thinking on this is that it is an implicit bias, or many of the biases are implicit. So while there's the bias blind spot, you might not be able, in fact, it's very unlikely you'll be able to detect in yourself as it is happening. You might still take the responsibility to sort of educate yourself, and even if instructions in themselves might not be enough, the awareness of bias and what it means might make you pay attention to situations in which you are at risk of bias.
1 minute.
I don't know, so maybe that was a bit all over the place.
No, it wasn't. So it would be a different way of attributing responsibility both judges and to juries, because by letting them know that there's a risk to objectivity and to the there might be a violation of the defendant's rights, they somehow become responsible via that information. Okay, and the judges, of course, have to know the rights of the defendant, and that's how they would be responsible. Yeah, I agree. I think that I should look at that, because this was just an interesting idea that I thought would connect responsibility for cognitive bias with the collective, but there are other proposals that might work, and I think going that way would help. Thank you.
Okay, we run out of time, so
Next. Okay, so our next speaker is, I'm not sure if I pronounce your name correctly, Lidén. And you have the floor.
How does this
30 minutes.
How do I change it?
Here. And, what's the other?
It's the second one?
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. And F5.
And I switch just using this one.
No, this is the
The
down.
arrows. Okay. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Lidén. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Department of Security and Crime Science at UCL in the UK. But my own faculty is the law faculty at Uppsala University in Sweden. That's also where I defended my thesis, which was on confirmation bias in criminal cases. I conducted experimental studies with Swedish police officers, prosecutors, and judges, testing for the prevalence of bias as well as potential de-biasing techniques. I will mention one of those studies today, the one with judges, but the focus of my talk is not confirmation bias, but instead a project that I'm conducting within the frames of my postdoc research, focusing on international criminal law. And this is titled, A Forecast on International Criminal Justice. Can judicial decisions at the International Criminal Court be predicted? I don't have a clue how much you know about the ICC, but there it is. It's located in The Hague, in the Netherlands. It became operational in 2002 on the basis of this document, the Rome Statutes of the ICC. The court has a very specific mandate to deal with specific types of crimes, and these are core international crimes. And that entails genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And the most recent or even ongoing example is, of course, the situation in Ukraine, where the court, or rather the Office of the Prosecutor, has opened an investigation. And currently there is a joint investigation team, including the ICC, the authorities in Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania. Ever since this court became operational in 2002, it has received quite a lot of attention and quite a lot of negative attention, I would say. And I think part of the explanation for that is that the court is dealing with a very difficult task to end impunity for these very, very serious crimes. At the same time, the court has some pretty significant limitations to its jurisdiction when it comes to not only the type of crime, but also geography, time restraints, and there's also something called the principle of complementarity that you might be aware of, meaning that the Office of the Prosecutor at the court shall only initiate charges if the national authorities do not. So the court has been criticized for being political to begin with, for example, in its selection of cases and what cases are not selected and so on. So there's all kinds of criticisms against this court. This picture I wanted to show you just to give you an idea of how enormous the cases are. The individuals that you see here, apart from two individuals in the back, one is the defendant, another one is the security guard. These are all legal actors. And of course, this is significantly more legal actors than you would see in an average sort of national jurisdiction courtroom. So the investigations go on for years. The hearings from pretrial phase to appellate phase can also go on for years. Hundreds or even thousands of decisions are made in each case. And there's also lots of different categories of interesting decision makers here, right? From a legal, psychological perspective or theoretical perspective. I decided to focus on this group of decision makers, so the ICC judges. I'm not sure this picture is fully updated, but it gives you a fairly representative picture. In the Rome Statute of the ICC, there are rules dictating who can be a judge at the court. There shall be equal representation in terms of the main legal systems in the world, in terms of countries, in terms of biological sex, and so on. And the judges that end up at the ICC are often very senior, which of course may make them very, capable of dealing with these very difficult, complex cases, but it can also mean that they sort of have set frames for their decision making from their long experiences in their home jurisdictions. So there might be a lot of individual differences between these judges, and individual differences are not in themselves negative or inherently a threat to the administration of justice, but it's still interesting to study what happens here. Of course, if you're an empirical researcher, as I am, and you want to learn something about decision making, you would ideally conduct an experimental study. That was completely impossible with these judges. There's not so many of them. They completely refused to be part of anything like that. I guess because there's a risk that it becomes self-identifying, right? And even if they did participate, all of them, there's just not enough participants for statistical power for me to be able to really draw conclusions. So what did I do? Well, I conducted an archive study, and this archive study is still ongoing. I'm still collecting data. I'll just present some preliminary results for you today. So far, I have reviewed cases from 5 different countries. So it's Kenya, Mali, the Central African Republic, the Ivory Coast, and the DRC. And these are the names of the accused in those cases. And those are the crimes that they were suspected of. And this is the status or the outcome in those respective cases to give me some sort of variety in my data. So far I've reviewed manually about 2,000 decisions in these cases, and it's decisions from the pretrial phase to the appellate phase, and it can include any type of decision. So a decision about an arrest warrant. Should we issue an arrest warrant? Shall we detain someone? Shall we allow the defense to change counsel or the prosecution to extend the page limit? You get the full range of decisions. Sometimes very small procedural decisions like that. And I coded all of these decisions for who the decision makers were, biological sex, the country of origin, and so on, and what type of decision was it, and what was the outcome, in the sense that is this primarily beneficial to the prosecution or to the defense or to the victims, and so on. So in my initial analysis, I did something called the chi-squared test, and this was just to see what variables, if any, I would then include in a larger regression model. And my preliminary analysis suggested that there were some individual factors among the judges that seemed to be correlated, because that's all I can say now, right? This is an archival study. It's about correlation, not about causality. But some individual factors were correlated with the outcome in the case. So the country of origin of the judges, the biological sex, and some contextual factors like the type of crime, the country under investigation, and whether the accused had been detained pre-trial. Since I also wanted to look at interactions, possible interactions between these variables, and how that was important for the outcome in the case, I conducted something called a regression model. These are the results of the regression analysis. I don't know how familiar you are with regression analysis, but I'll walk you through these preliminary results. So the first line here, you see, this means that the presiding judge's biological sex in interaction with his or her country of origin were significantly associated, correlated with the outcome in the case. Specifically, when the presiding judge was a female from South or Central America, the odds of a conviction were somewhat higher than if the presiding judge was a European male. Again, correlations, I don't really know why this correlation is there, but it's there. And also the type of crimes seem to matter somewhat, in the sense that if the court dealt with multiple types of crimes, so for example, war crimes and crimes against humanity at the same time, instead of just war crimes, the odds of a conviction were also slightly higher. And then we have the pretrial detention. This might seem obvious that this would be correlated with the outcome, but when someone was detained pre-trial, the odds of a conviction were actually 21 times higher, so that's a pretty large effect. As I said, there are many possible explanations. For example, if you have managed to detain someone, that might mean that there's more evidence in the case in general, which would explain the higher odds of a conviction. It might mean that you've been able to interview this person more. And there's also one other possible explanation of this that I identified in the research I did with Swedish judges. So now I'm going to take you on a little detour into that research project. As I mentioned, this study was about confirmation bias in Swedish judges. And what I was interested in here was whether a decision to, it's actually two questions I was interested in. can the decision to detain someone pre-trial trigger a confirmation bias that is somehow manifested in how you evaluate the evidence during the main hearing? That was the first question. The second question was, does it matter if it is the same judge who first decides about pre-trial detention as a single judge, that's how it happens in Sweden, and then is also the presiding judge during the main hearing? Or is it the same thing if you have different judges? So I looked at the evaluations of evidence and whether the judges decided to acquit or convict. I tested this in 8 different scenarios, and these are ceteris paribus conditions, so everything else remains fully constant. The only thing that varies here is whether the accused had been detained pre-trial and who had made that decision. So the evidence and the statements and so on were exactly the same. What I found in this study was that when it is the same judge who first decides to detain someone pre-trial and who then also function as the presiding judge in the main hearing, that judge tends to perceive of the total evidence against the accused as stronger, more indicative of guilt, and also perceive of the suspect's statement as less credible. Remember, the statement is still exactly the same. And that judge will also be more likely to convict. In fact, the odds of a conviction were 2.79 times higher. And when I say odds here, it's the risk from the defendant's point of view of being convicted were higher if the same judge had made that decision to detain pre-trial. I don't know to what extent this is at play in the decision-making of the ICC judges, but I think it might have a role, and one reason for that is that, as I mentioned, there might be hundreds or thousands of decisions made already during the pre-trial phase, and often they're made by just one judge that is assigned the case in the beginning. So while these decisions are not all strongly related to the assessment of whether someone is guilty or not, it is of course possible that a judge who repeatedly makes decisions about someone pre-trial forms his or her opinions before the actual trial. So this might be at play there, and be one possible explanation as to why the pre-trial detention was so strongly correlated with conviction. If you're interested in that research, it's published under that title. Oh, sorry. And maybe this could be interesting relating to what you spoke about in the previous presentation about excuses and so on. I think I have time to speak about that. The whole setup for this experiment was actually inspired by a case from the European Court of Human Rights. It's called Hauschild versus Denmark. I don't know if you heard of it. In the Hauschild case, Hauschild is detained. He's suspected of multiple frauds, and he's detained on multiple occasions prior to the main hearing. About 25 different decisions to keep him in custody. And all of those decisions are made by the same Danish judge. That same Danish judge is then also the presiding judge in the main hearing. So Hauschild then of course complains to the European Court of Human Rights saying, hey, this judge was biased, was definitely not impartial when he decided about my guilt. And the court agrees with him. So when these news reach the Swedish legislator, the legislator starts arguing, oh, does this mean that we need to change the Swedish Code of Judicial Procedure? And it comes to, because in the Swedish Code of Judicial Procedure, there's nothing stopping the same judge from making repeated detention decisions and then also deciding about guilt. But the legislator concludes that, nah, we're probably fine. It's probably good. And the reason for this is the differences in standards of proof in Denmark and Sweden. So for someone to be detained in Denmark, it's called särlig bestyrkt misstanke, which is something like reasonable suspicion or something like that. That's a fairly high standard of proof. At least it's higher than the Swedish standard of proof to detain someone, which is probable cause. So the legislator argues that while a Danish judge who has detained someone pre-trial probably is biased, a Swedish judge is not. And if you know something about psychology and confirmation bias, you know that it is probably more like the fact that you've made an assessment that this person should be detained in the first place instead of the standards of proof that are applicable. And in fact, when you start to talk about talk with Swedish or judges at Swedish district courts about this, there's an excuse from the legislator here, obviously, but there are also excuses from the judges. They perceive of it as way more practical and effective if you have the same judge from start to end. They know the case, so there's not a new judge who needs to reread and do all that stuff. So there's all kinds of excuses like that, but they can obviously do this in Denmark, right? They can change the judge. Yes, okay, so that was a bit of a detour. I'm going to take you back to the ICC judges now, and I talked a bit about the presiding judge, pretrial detention, and the type of crime. But we of course also have other judges involved in these cases. In the first instance, we would have 3 legally trained judges, and in the appellate court, we would have 5. So how does that impact on the outcome, or can we say anything about that? So just like with the presiding judge, I found here that the country of origin of these judges also seem to be important. So in judges from Central or South America, the odds of a vote to convict were slightly higher than in judges from Europe or the UK. And the odds of having another opinion, whether concurring or dissenting, were also somewhat higher in judges from Central or South America compared to judges from Asia. Again, I don't know why. These are just trends I'm seeing in the data. Biological sex. So females were slightly more likely to vote to convict. And they were also slightly more likely to have another opinion. And I guess the next steps in this research is now to try to statistically evaluate what is this? Okay, I'm seeing these trends, but can I say anything really about explanations? Can I evaluate maybe how different variables correlate with one another? Are there confounders here and so on? And also, of course, as I mentioned initially, I'm very interested in how this all plays out in practice. So if you have one judge who is presumably more inclined to convict, and you have one judge on the same bench who would be more likely to acquit, do we even have a problem? Maybe this is a really good thing that we have individual differences. So I guess that's really as far as I've come in this research as for now. And again, just emphasizing that while individual differences are often portrayed as a sort of inherent threat to the administration of justice, it's not necessarily the case. I think it can be if you have decisions that are regularly made only by one judge. And these decisions cannot be appealed, for instance. But if you have decision-making situations where you integrate dissent, that's what we want, right? Usually that would be a very good thing. And if judges could not disagree, then what would be the point of appealing and so on? Okay, that was actually all I prepared for my presentation.
So we have lots of time for questions.
I think this is really fascinating work, and I have a couple questions. So the first one is, I was curious about other variables that you might not have mentioned. So one is ideology or political affiliation, both of the country of origin, there's certain more conservative countries, more liberal countries, and of the judge. Because in the United States, other research, we know that who appointed Supreme Court Justice correlates with, different
Right.
decision-making things. The second was religion. Again, in the United States, we know, a number of members are Catholic, some are not. That
Right.
seems to correlate with certain things. So I'm kind of curious about how you decided on variables and whether there are other ones you might be interested in. The second question I had was, how in your previous work and thinking about this work, you know that it's confirmation bias that's in operation rather than something else. I mean, so one benign thing would be consistency. I treat everything the same. It's the same basic facts. I'm consistent. There are other, though, biases that could come into the fact, it's someone who's racist and the defendant is black in each of these cases or whatever the thing is. And so I'm wondering, how do we know it's confirmation bias? Certainly there's other research in other areas with prosecutors who start with a frame of guilt and seem to filter everything. No judges do this in other contexts. How do we know here? And then the final just little comment is I was just thinking about how interesting, back when I was a law clerk on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, there were two clerks, one Supreme Court, one DC Circuit Court, who wanted to start a business predicting this as a business, right? So that we could predict judicial opinions.
Yeah.
And they went out and started going to law firms to try to get, and hedge funds and stuff to try to get money. And then they worried that they were going to ruin their legal career because no judges want to think that their work is predictable. And so they got scared off. But it's interesting because I think there is the potential. I don't know if other people in this country know whether in certain countries there's bet on outcomes because you can see in the criminal court this has deep financial implications for maybe an entire country, different things. Whether you know whether there is any actual predictive marketing sort of in financial systems where people are actually placing money bets.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I'm going to try as...
Yeah, sorry.
I'm going to start with your first question, I think, so I can still remember it.
Sure.
About the choice of variables.
Yeah.
So I think the choice of variables, that was very much motivated by what was available in the decisions. There are certain things like ideology or religion that you would not necessarily be able to, get hold of in relation to these judges. Possibly, they might have made that official somewhere in the, selection process or something like that. That's still not impossible to include in the model in the end. So when I'm done, whenever I'm done, you could probably do this for 10 years if you wanted to. But when I decide that I'm done, you could probably add that as a predictor variable if you can get access to that information and see what happens. But yeah, it has been a very much driven by what is available in the cases. The second question about confirmation bias and how do we know, I think we don't really know. And I think what you're alluding to with the whole overlap between different biases, that's something I've written a bit about in the thesis, and I do feel like that is a bit problematic actually, because we often tend to use different names for very similar behaviors. Sometimes you can argue that maybe this is rational and then maybe we should not call it a bias, and so on. So I think it is consistent with how confirmation bias is described in the literature. With the detention decision, you have to, by law, form a hypothesis about someone's guilt. You need to have reasonable suspicion, or you need to have probable cause. And then that might impact on how you evaluate the subsequent evidence. I'm not sure, I guess that would have been, since this is a randomized experience, it could be that judges are, just willing to be sort of consistent with themselves. But if you have such tendencies in judges, and you have a randomized experiment, you would expect that to be distributed equally in both those who detain and do not detain, so that it shouldn't logically explain the entire effect, but it's a possibility. The third question about predictions, that's a very interesting one, and I think I don't really know about what this looks like internationally. There might be someone in here who knows more about that. Certainly with use of automated approaches, you would be able to sort of include more data than what I have here, because I've looked into possibilities to find some sort of algorithm or something like that, even for the coding of the data. But since it's so inconsistent, all the decisions look so different, you actually have to do it manually. Was the question, what is there a future for this?
Or even whether, in the UK you can bet on anything. I'm wondering whether actually someone is actually even developing a deep learning algorithm to analyze all cases in the United States and actually place financial bets, because this company's stock's going to go down when it has an adverse decision or the Supreme Court decides not to grant cert. I was wondering if anyone knew if that actually is already happening.
I haven't heard of it, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's coming soon. I certainly I'm thinking about another archive study I did with Swedish reopened cases. I also did that manually, which is insane. It's like a super boring, uninspired thing to do, but you get really good data, right? And that's what you want. And I did regression analysis on that, and I could, based on the type of crime and whether the individual was applying on his or her own or together with a legal counsel, you could predict like 95% of those cases accurately. Because it's just no in most of the cases. The cases are not reopened, right? So I think there might be certain types of decisions that are easier to predict and use such models for than others. But yeah, we'll see what comes in the future in that field.
Federico.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. The first one is regarding how you identify the content of the decision, and and the question is, would it not be better to, rather than base the identification on the criminal crime, the criminal description, the type of crime like war crime or against humanity? Instead of that, the actual actions that are being the judges are trying to establish that occur. So if it is a massive killing or anything that, because maybe that can have some incident, the kind of evidence that they observe and how they evaluate evidence, and maybe there can be differences according to which action they are researching upon.
Yeah.
And the second one is maybe a strategy. I'm not sure about it. I would like to know what you think about it. And a strategy to try to figure out if confirmation bias or another kind of bias is at play here is to look upon counterfactual. Okay?
Oh, sorry, on what?
Counterfactual.
Counterfactual.
Sorry.
Okay.
Counterfactual. In which cases confirmation bias does not seem to be at play. So, for example, in which cases they do not confirm the first,
right.
what it seems to be which regions they. So, if in those cases we can see that they revise what they thought to be the case in the first place, maybe it's a reason to think that confirmation bias is not at play. But if they do not do that, or maybe that's a reason to think that without confirmation bias. So maybe to look at cases in which what seems to be a confirmation bias is not really not at play, it can help to figure out if it's at play in other cases.
Yeah, no, I think I'll start with that. I think that's a very good point, and you definitely, when you start to study confirmation bias, there's definitely a risk of, getting the bias yourself. Definitely, in how you you tend to see it everywhere. That's a very human thing, and how you have to think very carefully, very, very carefully about how you design your experiments and so on, so that you're not just sort of proving your own hypothesis, pushing your own hypothesis. And that might be one possible way of sort of doing it from the other end. Like in which cases was it not confirmed? I think you could probably get that data pretty easily by looking at like trial chamber, appeals chamber, but then of course you have different judges and so on. But yeah, I guess that would be an important part of it. And I think, generally in these studies, I don't think I will make any, strong claims about confirmation bias, because there's just no way I can sort of support that. Even with the experimental data, that can be a bit sort of shaky, I guess. Did that answer that question?
Yes.
Sort of. And the first question you had was about, the more specific conduct. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea, and I think that's the plan, because that's a sort of constant, right? In these cases, whether it's sexual crimes, whether it's attacks against civilians or
Sorry,
property.
coffee break.
Oh, okay. I don't want to keep you from your coffee break, but that's definitely a good idea.